afternoon. I am Wesley Stefanik. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Delaware Association of Realtors. Thank you for joining our hot topic session today titled Challenges in Fair Housing. We appreciate you tuning in this afternoon as we, not just here in Delaware, but across the United States, recognize Fair Housing Month. There's many fair housing related challenges right now, and I'm pleased to welcome an expert on all issues fair housing related, and that's my friend Laurie Benner, the Associate Vice President of Housing and Community Development at the National Fair Housing Alliance. We have allocated time for Laurie's presentation. We allocated time after Laurie's presentation for questions. So if you have any, please feel free to put them in the chat directly to me, and then we will ask them after she concludes her presentation. So with that, give me 1 second, Laurie. I'd like to welcome you here. I got to make sure I can unmute you too. Welcome, Laurie. Appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Fair Housing Month has come with its own set of challenges, technical challenges, um, you know, challenges in the administration, and that's a big part of why what we're going to talk about today. Which is why you'll see once I start get to that part of the presentation why I needed my notes because there's just no way that anyone can keep it all in their head. There's really a lot happening right now. So I'm going to go ahead with that. I will go ahead and once again share my screen, share my presentation, and we will be good to go. So again, thank you for inviting me to visit with your members, Wes.
of course.
The foundation of this presentation came from a keynote that I recently gave, and the conference theme was level up. And so I kind of just decided to roll with it and keep this general theme for this. So you might recognize Get Up, Stand Up as the title of a Bob Marley song. I love all kinds of music and I travel all over to see live music and festivals and concerts. So you'll notice this theme throughout my presentation by way of song titles relating to civil rights, freedom, and protest. And as I mentioned, we are in a place now where civil liberties, fair housing, consumer protection are being attacked and rights are being stripped away. So I'm going to encourage all of you to lean into or level up on your efforts as it comes to fair housing. For those of you who are not familiar, the National Fair Housing Alliance, or NAFA, is a 37-year-old civil rights nonprofit dedicated to eliminating discrimination in housing. We're a member-based organization and have hundreds of housing and fair housing partners all across the country. We engage in education and outreach, such as this, consulting and compliance, advocacy and public policy work, and investigation and enforcement, which sometimes leads to litigation. Now, in the real estate world, we tend to think of fair housing through a discrimination-focused lens. At NAFA, we look at it as a much broader civil rights issue. So as you can see here, where you live matters. I know there's a lot of text on this slide, but it's really just meant to illustrate the fact that the location of your home determines your access or your lack of access to everything that you need to live a physically healthy and economically prosperous life. It's the center point for your access to education, transportation, healthcare, employment, and so on and so on. And this access has not historically been equally available to all people. And that's where we'll begin today. I'm going to root part of this presentation in history because, after all, it's National Fair Housing Month. And I want to level set with that. And then we'll talk about how things are now. And I hope to impart some actionable insights for you. So the next slide is about 3 minutes of a 9-minute documentary that NAFA created for the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act. I'll encourage all of you to go and watch the full video. It's like about 9 minutes. But again, I use this really to ground us in the foundation of fair housing and a commemoration of the fact that it is National Fair Housing Month.
few in the nation believe that fair housing would in our time become the unchallenged law of this land. And indeed, this bill has had a long and stormy trip.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man.
Ladies and gentlemen, Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
The death of the prophet of nonviolence set off the worst outbreak of arson, looting, and criminal activity in the nation's history. Washington's ghettos burned within a few blocks of the nation's capital.
The life of a man who symbolized the freedom and faith of America has been taken. And no words of mine can fill the void of the eloquent voice that has been stilled. But this I do believe deeply. The dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has not died with him.
President Johnson was willing to speak up and say, we have to pass a fair housing bill.
Hello, Mr. President? Yes, Dick. We're in trouble. We need some help. Yes? I'm afraid of that.
Federal troops, for the first time since the Civil War, took up positions to guard government buildings.
Nothing's probably touchier than your own neighborhood and your own home or your own apartment. The administration, which supported the bill, said this has no chance. The other stuff is okay, but this will kill any politician that touches it.
Well, I just could not live inside them. I don't feel that they should be oppressed, but I moved here because it was a white community.
I have 2 daughters and 2 sons, and if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out.
I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they are allowed to move in here in any number.
So again, that is the historical perspective that really leads us to where we are today. There was a flurry of housing-related laws and policies enacted during the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 was deeply controversial, and the real estate industry, notably NAR, opposed the law. Now, the Fair Housing Act has been expanded since to include additional protected classes, and an important provision of the Fair Housing Act, known as affirmatively furthering fair housing, has ebbed and flowed since then, being strengthened and weakened in accordance with various federal administrations. The most important thing to note is that these laws related to government and quasi-government agencies, they were all instituted in the interest of consumer protection and the furtherance of equal opportunity. Now, I mentioned earlier how dramatically the landscape for housing, fair housing, and civil rights is shifting. A more accurate way to look at it is that things are regressing. The current administration has engaged in a series of actions that are worsening the fair and affordable housing crisis. So the actions turn the basic definition of fairness and civil rights upside down and undermined those that are merely seeking fair opportunity to achieve the American dream, and a safe and stable place to call home. So this is a little bit of the shock and awe portion of the presentation. I'll give you a very, very high level overview of these various shifts, and I know it's going to be overwhelming. So I encourage you to take a note of anything that piques your interest or anything that you want to hear more about, because as Wes said, we'll have time for Q&A at the end. And this is why I needed to have access to my notes, because I'm going to throw a lot of information at you in the next few minutes here, based on each of these bullet points. So increasing housing costs for renters, buyers, and homeowners, policy changes relating to tariffs, immigration, and delay of national infrastructure projects already appropriated in the Inflation Reduction Act or the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act will increase the cost of housing, especially for middle income Americans, and it will also generally make housing less accessible. There have also been performative actions put forth, such as directing agencies to deliver emergency housing price relief without the administrative structure or funding to do so. Finally, the Federal Housing Finance Agency Administration, FHFA, directed government-sponsored entities, Fannie and Freddie, to eliminate important tenant protections, and it also rescinded guidance intended to protect consumers from unfair and deceptive practices. They're moving towards a place of increased interest rates and riskier loans. The second, rolling back established fair housing rights. The attack on basic civil rights under the guise of attacking DEI or DEIA mandates, policies, programs, and funding is already undermining fair and affordable housing and credit opportunities. HUD and DOGE canceled federal funding for half of recipients, causing chaos, staff cuts, agency closures. These housing organizations assist people with disabilities, seniors, families with children, victims of domestic violence, and others in dire situations that rely on these vital services to ensure that they have safe, affordable, and accessible homes. And moreover, these grants have received bipartisan support for decades, which makes it even more disappointing. HUD fair housing complaint mechanisms have been limited to solely the online portal, and the staff required to respond to those online requests have been reduced, making it almost impossible for HUD to effectively handle fair housing complaints. HUD and the Department of the Interior created a joint task force to identify public lands to build housing with no framework to ensure that the affordable housing developments will be part of inclusive, thriving communities with good jobs, schools, transportation, all the things we talked about earlier, or it will further isolate people who need access to affordable housing. Last year, there were requirements published to create a structure for consumer-initiated appraisal reconsideration of value so that there were standards to ensure fair and consistent treatment of consumers and decrease industry liability. Last month, that guidance was rescinded. FHFA directed the GSEs to discontinue all efforts on special purpose credit programs, or SPCPs. As a side note, for those of you who are not familiar with SPCPs, they were made allowable by the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, and they allowed lenders to create loan programs for underserved groups of people. FHFA also rescinded requirements for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to create equitable housing finance plans, which were intended to outline how the agencies would equitably serve all people. FHFA issued an order requiring Fannie Mae to end its repair all strategy for its REO inventory and to return to a portfolio neutral approach. So this raises questions about whether Fannie Mae will repair homes, particularly in communities of color, or create blight and which would drive down prices in those communities. So as an aside, NAFA, I think 3 years ago, secured the largest settlement in the history of the Fair Housing Act against Fannie Mae for its unequal treatment of foreclosed properties post-financial crisis. We still have litigation pending against Bank of America and Deutsche Bank for the similar circumstances. So this particular rescission obviously is a huge red flag for us. Under this category here, The CFPB moved to reverse a settled redlining case that the administration, and that signals that the administration will no longer protect communities who have been unfairly denied credit. I know this is a lot. I'll run through the remaining sections a little bit more quickly. The third, rolling back established rights for LGBTQ plus individuals. The administration terminated rights for LGBTQ plus by limiting the definition of sex to two unchangeable sexes, male and female. And HUD also issued an order to halt any pending future enforcement actions related to HUD's 2016 equal access rule. That ensured equal access to HUD assisted and HUD insured housing without regard to perceived or actual sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. Number 4, rolling back established rights for immigrants. HUD and the Department of Homeland Security entered into a memorandum of understanding to collaborate to identify undocumented immigrants who are ineligible for federal housing assistance and make remedial actions, including referral for HUD immigration enforcement action. I'm sorry, not HUD, but they make referrals for immigration enforcement action. The USDA rescinded a policy that provided eligibility for legal non-citizens with Social Security numbers and work authorization to apply for its single-family housing guaranteed loan program. Number 5, ignoring the threat to local communities from climate change, HUD terminated the $1 billion Green and Resilient Retrofit Program, which would have made HUD-assisted multifamily properties safe from natural disasters. HUD removed requirements that grantees perform fair housing assessments and certify compliance with the Fair Housing Act and other federal civil rights when administering long-term disaster recovery funding. Eviscerating key agencies that provide people with access to fair and affordable housing. DOJ suspended many of the activities of the Civil Rights Division and reassigned those attorneys and leadership to prosecute officials from sanctuary cities that protect immigrants. CFPB and DOJ suspended the agency's activities and staff, including its ability to enforce the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and other consumer protection laws. The FHFA director fired 14 members of the 25-member board at Fannie and Freddie, installed himself as the chairman of both boards, which is a violation of the law, installed FHFA's general counsel as a member of both boards, and then fired Fannie Mae's entire audit committee. FHFA placed employees of the following sections on administrative leave: Division of Public Interest Examinations, Division of Accounting Standards, Division of Research and Statistics, and Office of Minority and Women Inclusion. So HUD intends to cut all high-level staff within the Office of Field Policy and Management. They're working towards a place where they're going to cut HUD staff by 50% and cut up to 75% of the staff that within the the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And that department is responsible for carrying out HUD's legal obligations under the Fair Housing Act. And finally, jeopardizing citizens' data privacy and protection. The administration rescinded the federal government's framework for responsible artificial intelligence, or AI, and unleashed AI and other automated systems to experiment on the people of America in housing and financial services with no guardrails for safe, secure, and trustworthy auditing framework. And so all of this without security clearances or training, DOJ gained access to personal confidential data of the people, people all across America through these government databases. So here, we'll take a deep breath. That was a lot. I have a little palate cleanser for you. It's a baby. This is my friend's baby. So when I'm immersed in all of this, I go visit these babies and it just kind of resets everything. We'll switch now to talk about how, kind of what's happening. All of that is happening on the high level, federal and national level, um, in terms of government. So we'll also talk a little bit about more pertinent kind of real estate industry, more specific real estate industry connected types of things. And one of the biggest hot topics right now, I know many of you are tuned into the debate, or maybe even we could call it an outright battle when it comes to exclusive listing networks or private listing networks. So, on one hand, I have no desire to be part of a big national argument on this topic. On the other hand, I absolutely do. I have an obligation to, and to that end, so do a lot of you. Realtors have the opportunity to be a source of stability in what's otherwise been a very rapidly shifting environment. So, just as my organization and I are, you are all ultimately consumer focused. NAFA has long advocated against policies and practices that are antithetical to an open and transparent real estate market. And exclusive or private listing networks are just that. When something is exclusive, someone is being excluded. It's a huge step backwards in an industry that's finally, reckoned with its past and acknowledged the harm that it's caused. So what you see on your screen here is an excerpt from the 1950s Realtor Code of Ethics. Again, this is rooting this in the history and how we kind of got to where we are today. It's been well documented that the real estate profession has caused a lot of harm to communities across the country historically. And we're now in a space where we're moving past that and creating structures for folks to really not only versus repair harms, but to help create healthy, vibrant communities. So at a conference in California last week, the CEO of one of the biggest real estate brands in the country, when asked, said, "I didn't want to talk about fair housing." And that was very telling to me. He dismissed the importance of inclusivity and seemed to mock the very real fact that homeownership and wealth gaps do exist. So the charts that you see here on the screen are just kind of a snapshot of some of those disparities. As I said earlier, this is really the time to emphasize fair housing and equitable opportunities, and that's something that we can all continue to contribute to together. For many years, NAFA has published an annual trends report that outlines what's happening in the world of fair housing. If you go to our website, you can see an interactive map that shows how many and what types of fair housing complaints are happening on a state-by-state basis. So it's important to note that the vast majority of fair housing violations never get reported. So the numbers are grossly low. Fair housing complaints are rising year after year, and you might ask yourself, as I have, if the complaints keep rising, are all of these fair housing organizations effective? And the answer is yes. Education and outreach are crucial so that consumers know their rights and know what to do if their rights have been violated. So that, again, that's where you all come in. And we'll talk more about that next. The number one category of fair housing complaints every year continues to be disability, although complaints related to harassment are increasing exponentially. It's also important to note that over 75% of all fair housing complaints are handled by private nonprofit fair housing organizations. So remember how I said that funding is being drastically cut for all of these organizations, and they are reducing staff, and a lot of them are going to have to completely shut down because of these funding decisions. It's an absolutely devastating problem as it pertains to housing and fair housing. Now, for the presentations that I have, been giving in Fair Housing Month and in the coming months, I'm typically asked to impart some encouragement and positivity. And it's not lost on me that I seem to fail spectacularly in that. But I will share with you that housing advocates, civil rights firms, justice forward law firms, and others are working literally around the clock using every tool at their disposal to protect and preserve citizens' rights. Again, this is where we need all of you to do your part on behalf of consumers in your jurisdictions. So, the first area I'll touch on is education. It's important to stay informed, to continually update your knowledge of fair housing laws and regulations, including the Fair Housing Act, which is what you all are doing right here today. Understanding the protected classes and the nuances, educate your clients about their fair housing rights and responsibilities. And I refer to that both on the buyer and the seller side because there are responsibilities and rights on both sides of that. So it's equally important to inform each. And as far as the education, I would take it one step further to not just clients. So I know a lot of you are probably active on social media, on maybe community, Facebook groups, that type of thing. And you've probably all seen some nonsense. Maybe if there's like a housing development being proposed or something like that, you've probably all seen some nonsense from people who are not aware of fair housing, or sometimes people who are just like blatantly racist. Use your opportunity, use your voice to help educate others about fair housing and about these issues. Seek out training. Y'all are doing that right here today. And use the resources. And I know that, Wes mentioned early on about some of these. NAR has the new Fairhaven. There's a lot of great content out there. The next is unbiased service. So that's been a big theme, implicit bias. Over the last couple of years, we've talked about steering has been a big topic ever since Long Island Divided was released a little over 5 years ago. Create checklists, create some framework so that you really genuinely are providing equal service to all of your clients so that you can reduce the possibility that any implicit bias may sneak into your conversations with folks. Because that's the whole point is, everyone has biases and you may not always be aware of them. Some of these biases are so deeply held from when you were raised. It's not even something that may be on your radar. So that, and part of that is, asking unbiased questions of your clients to really fully understand their needs and their preferences. Accountability is an interesting one because several years ago, NAR developed a broker self-testing program. And there is a broker in the Midwest who talks about her experience with that program. And when she talks about it, she says that her agents, they did a testing process on her agents. And she said, I couldn't tell the difference between a biased agent and a lazy agent. And she went on to say that, as part of the testing, there was an agent that was contacted maybe on a Wednesday afternoon and had a full conversation and great follow-up and sent the information, sent the properties. And then another was contacted on a Friday afternoon and the person was just completely blown off and didn't get, an adequate or even an equivalent amount of service and follow-up. And so that is to say, again, to make sure that you are offering equivalent services, feedback, all of those things. Maybe if you are in a place where you cannot at that moment provide the kind of service that you would want to, put off the conversation or, let the potential client know what's going on, that you've got other things happening, or you're going to an appointment, or whatever it is. So there's some structures and mechanisms that you can take in your business practices that will help negate any potential for bias, either intentional, excuse me, or unintentional. The number one thing I really want to impart on all of you is that fair housing is still the law of the land. Although things are a mess at the national level, you still have state laws to fall back on. And I strongly encourage all of you to, use all available resources into whatever enforcement efforts, or accountability measures that you can take. At this time, we really cannot rely on HUD intake and enforcement processes and local fair housing agencies. Those that will still be able to remain open will be severely under-resourced. So it's up to all of us to do the right things for, the residents, the consumers, the folks who are in your areas, to not only uphold the law, but the ethical tenets of our profession. And part of that is correcting fair housing violations when they occur, reporting violations as they occur, using mechanisms throughout that are embedded in the Realtor Code of Ethics to help with accountability. Y'all are out there interacting with each other, and so you are the biggest source of accountability for one another. We've heard over and over again the whole, one bad apple spoils the bunch. And there is something to that in terms of the reputation of realtors, real estate agents, and again, holding one another accountable for those actions. So even though federal housing and civil rights retractions are happening, there's these sweeping real estate industry practices that are constantly changing. Underpin all of that with the fact that fair housing at this moment still is the law of the land. And then for anyone who's interested in these songs or a playlist that has, the song titles and many others, here is a QR code for that playlist. There is the explicit lyrics warning there, because not all of the songs are the clean versions of them. So I will end with that, and I thank you again. I don't see at this moment any questions in the chat, but certainly I am available to answer anything.
Thank you, Laurie. I do have a few questions that came in, but are you still there? I just want to share a couple other items before that. So if you have any more questions, feel free to put those in the chat. But Laurie, when you referenced education, on that, if anybody is interested, if you're not familiar with the Long Island Divided situation that occurred, we actually did an interview with Bill Dedman, who was one of the reporters on that project. I would say, what, 4 or 5 years ago now. I'm going to put the link to our video library in the chat. Scroll all the way down to the bottom and you'll be able to watch that video. I believe it was 2021 or 2022. Maybe it was even 2020 at this point. But you can watch that. Also in that library is just other videos we've done over the years on different issues in fair housing. I will also make a quick pitch. I'm going to put the link in to the chat as well for the Fair Housing Champion certification that we offer at the association. You'll be able to see the requirements to receive that certification. And if you meet all of them, you can apply for it and then advertise it publicly once you have achieved those requirements. The last thing I want to mention real quick is also with education. You're going to be hearing if that CE requirements are going to be changing specifically with fair housing in Delaware. The Real Estate Commission is considering those changes right now. There's a recommendation from their education committee. And you'll see that we're going to go from an hour and a half of education to about a full 3-hour module. But that's going to be rolling out if that's all approved shortly. I also, real quick, Laurie, before I get into the questions, I'm going to welcome our association's attorney, Andy Taylor. He's going to give a little more about Delaware's Fair Housing Act before we get into questions. Welcome, Andy.
Hello, folks. Thanks, Wes. Laurie, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. I particularly think it's good to put it in the historical context and unfortunately to hear about what we're all dealing with now. So, just to let you know, those of you on the presentation, in case you're not aware of DAR's longstanding support for fair housing after the amendments made to the Federal Act in the late 80s, DAR was asked, well, how could we help amend Delaware's law? And the CEO at the time said, well, call Andy Taylor. So I was hired by the Human Relations Commission, Division of Human Relations called at the time, to head up the legislative drafting committee to rewrite Delaware's Fair Housing Act. And we have one of the strongest in the country in the way of its scope and its enforcement provisions. And DAR was instrumental in helping to lobby that through our General Assembly in the House and the Senate. And it passed very well through both chambers and then being signed by the governor. So DIR can take some pride in being a longstanding advocate for fair housing. I would also say, seeing what's happening on the national level, it's going to be all the more important for us locally to, as Laurie indicated, to be advocates locally for all fair housing efforts and maybe, pick up the slack locally where some slack might become apparent on the federal level. So I just wanted to offer people encouragement that way. Okay, we can be helpful in all of this. Okay, thanks,
Thank,
Wes.
yeah, thank you, Andy. All right, Laurie, I do have a couple questions here. First and foremost, the video at the start that you showed, where can individuals find that if they're looking for it, the full video?
I can drop a link to the chat, but if you Google NAFA, NFHA 7 days documentary, you should be able to find it. That was great information that Andy shared there. What is the licensing cycle in Delaware?
Yep, it's every 2 years, and I
Every
believe,
2 years.
yep, the next one is a year from now, this ending a year from now.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, so a couple years ago, I did some research. So we're similar here in Maryland. It's an hour and a half every 2 years for fair housing education. And I was floored to realize that half the states in the country had no fair housing continuing education requirement for their real estate licensees. That just absolutely blew my mind. I guess it probably shouldn't, but it did. So I did a little side quest and I made a spreadsheet of every single state in the country and its fair housing, real estate, continuing education requirements. And I turned it over to NAR and said, this is crazy. We should do something about this. So I'd like to think that perhaps maybe that may have had a little piece of, the impetus for NAR now requiring all realtors to have 2 hours of fair housing education every 3 years.
Yep, and on that point, just so everyone was aware, we as an association worked with the Real Estate Commission's Education Committee to make sure that the requirements of the NAR requirement will be incorporated into the new module design that's happening. So if you take a module one within the new cycle, it hasn't started yet, it's not official yet, but all the content that is required will be within whatever module one class that you take in the future. So just so you know, a lot more to come on that topic. It's a little preliminary, but that's most likely what's going to happen. Laurie, just so everyone also is aware, we'll have the recording of this video available in that video library. It's in the chat already. It's the first link that I had sent out. So feel free to watch that later. We'll also send it out in our fast fax emails. Laurie, how can individuals find the Fed cuts that you mentioned specifically within fair housing? Is there a location somewhere online?
Um, Not exactly. And the challenge with that is it's changing so rapidly. And I think, you and I may have touched on this when you reached out to me about this presentation, that, the things that I'm telling everyone right now today might not be the same tomorrow, might not be the same next week. So keeping up with it is extremely difficult. I can send you a document that you can share with your members that outlines, kind of what I just spoke about, with the caveat that it's updated as of, I think our policy team put it together maybe last week. So things are really, really changing rapidly. So yeah, so on the NAFA website, there is some information about that we created in the fall around election time to talk about Project 2025, which is, more broad, but in the housing context and how that may play out. Now, what we're seeing now is it is playing out. The administration gave us a playbook as to what they were going to do, and they are doing it. So there's our policy priorities on our website. But again, in terms of the specifics of each of these things, there's not really kind of a ticker tape of what's happening.
You mentioned in one of the slides about what our members can do, and then you summed it up with saying that fair housing is still the law of the land. So how do you usually handle naysayers?
Um,
What
that's
can our
an
members do
interesting question.
or what can our members do to handle naysayers?
Yeah, I mean, in some respects, there's no such thing as necessarily as being a naysayer. Like, it is the law, period. Until that changes, knock on wood or whatever. Fair Housing Act is still in place. It's still the law. There are actions being taken to, weaken different provisions. And so an interesting kind of policy, insider baseball is, for example, there was talk of, opening up the Fair Housing Act to add protected classes. And that sounds great. Yes, let's add some more protected classes. But the danger of that is if you open it up, there could be unintended consequences and they could end up actually stripping things out of it. So that's why a lot of times you'll see amendments to, adding protected classes, things of that nature. I mean, again, I would just simply say it is the law, period. The Realtor Code of Ethics for folks who, are Realtor members, the Code of Ethics still is, there are still structures in there for fair housing, for inclusion, for all of those things. So there are enforcement mechanisms within the Code of Ethics. Yeah, it is hard because you don't necessarily want to get into a political argument with someone. So really, to be diplomatic about it really is just, it is the law, period. It's the national law. Here's our state law. Here's our local jurisdiction. To the extent that localities have additional protected classes, you can just keep it at that.
I'm going to send a link also in the chat for everybody. If you're interested in learning more about Delaware specific, the Division of Human and Civil Rights, here's their website, so you can check that out. They do talk a little more about fair housing here. There's a Fair Housing Information Center. If you're not familiar with the website or that organization, it used to be called the Human Relations Commission, I believe, but they did change their name a year or two ago at this point. Laurie, one more question. Do you have any comments on building codes that limit single-family house occupancy by no more than 4 unrelated individuals?
That is incredibly specific. I know I've seen that in a lot of college towns and like vacation resort areas. I mean, residential zoning was created as a tool for discrimination and segregation. That is why it exists. So, overly restrictive zoning codes, building codes, etc., a lot of times are a perpetuation of that. I know that we've all seen in areas, it's incredibly frustrating because there seems to be a sentiment of we need more affordable housing, we need more accessible housing, but not here. That's the NIMBYism, not in our neighborhood. But on the other hand, there is a big hesitation to have any kind of statewide or national interference because those building and zoning codes are so localized. So I would love to be able to have some really fantastic answer for that. But as long as I have been working in housing and real estate, it's like the perpetual debate.
Yep.
So I think there has to be, yeah, I think there has to be a willingness of policymakers, of legislators to not let the voices of the NIMBYs overtake common sense.
Yeah, just so everyone on the call that's aware that it right now is a big debate here in Delaware. There's discussion and ideas being floated to see where the state should override local zoning based on the NIMBYism that exists. So that is definitely a current debate right now here, and something that we as an association are surely going to be involved in whenever there's something more formal. But even informally, there's organizations that are being created right now to kind of tackle that. I know I just met with someone about Reimagine Delaware. They are looking into this and seeing what can be done to maybe open up and allow more zoning changes, but more balance between the state and local to kind of fight the NIMBYism back a bit. Uh, with that, I actually have no more questions, I believe. So Lori, if anybody does have any follow-ups, is there an easy way to reach out to you?
Sure. Anybody can email me. So it's lbenner@nationalfairhousing.org. And when you disseminate additional information to either the folks who registered for the webinar or your members at large, feel free to include my contact information. I did notice I was going to put something in the chat, but it looks like I can't put things in the chat. So I'll follow up with you about, with a link to the video and any other resources that you might think would be valuable to your members.
Yeah, that's great. Well, with that, I do have a lot of people that said thank you. They really appreciate the presentation. We always wish more members attended, but hopefully they will watch the recording when
It's
we.
a busy time of year, and I appreciate your patience with my technical challenges.
All good. Well, Lori, thank you again for taking the time. Thank you to all of the members for also attending. We appreciate you. And with that, we'll end the call. Thank you.